Thank you, Mary. Hi, it's wonderful to be here today. A warm and loving good afternoon to you. I'm so excited we're here to celebrate effective healing, and it's my joy to be Sunrise Haven's Executive Director, and I'm Robin Banco. Now, it's also my pleasure to introduce Lauren Nofsinger. She's a lifelong Christian Scientist who has loved serving God since her early years in Sunday school. After receiving a dual degree in international relations and German from Mount Holyoke College, she was accepted into the Mother Church's military chaplain training program, and that was in 2006. While training in Boston, she met and married her husband, Rob, and together they embarked on their journey as military chaplains. They were stationed at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, where Lauren served with an airborne unit and then in special operations. She was deployed to Kuwait for a year, where she had the privilege of bringing the love of the Mother Church to service members throughout the country. The Army then, we're grateful to say, brought Lauren and her family to the Joint Base Lewis McChord, which if you came from Seattle, you drove right by it on the way here, and it's in Tacoma, and that was in 2016. And after leaving the military service, we're so glad they decided to make their home here in Seattle. Lauren now serves the Mother Church as the assistant to the chaplain endorser, and she provides administrative support for the chaplain training program, and that's under the Committee of Publication Office. She is so grateful to have the opportunity to support local branch church activities and to focus more time on the public practice of Christian Science healing. Lauren is going to be giving a talk today entitled Effective Triumph, Demonstrating the Principle of Being. Please join me in welcoming Lauren.
Thank you, Robin. It's a real privilege to be here with you all. There's another microphone up here. I don't want to. There we go. Good. I'll put it back then. Well, I've been blessed over the years to receive Christian Science nursing care for a variety of situations, some for injury as well as for the births of my two daughters. And I say blessed because of how Christian Science nursing has helped me to deepen my understanding and practice of Christian Science. All of us studying Christian Science and demonstrating its teachings are Christian Science practitioners and Christian Science nurses, whether we advertise ourselves as such or not, because we all have the opportunities daily to heal and to care for situations that need healing. So the theme of our gathering today is celebrating effective healing. And the nursing arts reveal wonderful metaphysical concepts that are essential to this healing work. So through the lens of my first experience with Christian Science nursing, I'd like to explore with you how the metaphysical qualities of the nursing arts helps us to deepen our relationship with God and to bring more effective and whole healing to the world. Well, a number of years ago, I was the program director for a horsemanship program at a Christian Science summer camp. And one morning, the campers were bringing their horses in to saddle them up and get ready for our daily rides and activities. And there had been a horse that had been having a challenge being tied to a railing. We'd thought we'd addressed that problem, but that morning, the horse seemed, as soon as she was tied, seemed to have another reoccurrence of this challenge where she got scared and would pull back from the railing. And the camper wasn't able to untie her quickly enough. And so she was really shaking and pulling on the fence and seemed to be stuck. So I asked the camper to move away, and I went to go and attempt to untie her. Well, in the process of doing this, the horse, in her fright, reared up and struck me in my face and in my stomach and knocked me to the ground and trampled me. Well, I don't know personally what happened next, but I was told that some of the other counselors came over, cut the line that the horse was tied to, moved the horse and everyone, all of the campers away, made sure that the campers were safe, and then called the Christian Science nurse and Christian Science practitioner who were there on the property to come and assist. I was laying there for a period of time with head and facial fractures, a dislocated hip, broken thigh, and several internal injuries. But when I awoke, my physical condition was not the first thing that I thought of. I remember seeing the two smiling faces of the Christian Science nurse and the practitioner, and they were assuring me that God was right there and nothing but his love and his goodness could ever be felt. And that's what I was thinking about. It never occurred to me to request medical attention, as I'd grown up in Christian Science and had relied on Christian Science and on God for my every need. So I knew in that instant that he was attending to me, and he was going to be the one to heal me. I was assisted into a van, taken to the Christian Science nursing facility there on the property, and lovingly cared for. I was bathed, dressed, and fed, helped into a bed, and the Christian Science nurse and the Christian Science practitioner gave incredibly loving and attentive care. The injuries seemed to be many, but I remember clearly that my thought was so filled with God's loving presence that I had really little concern for my physical situation. I knew that God and the Christian Science nurse and practitioner were taking care of everything. And this is where I began to learn the power of Christian Science nursing, which attends to the human needs through spiritually directed care, so the patient's thought can rest on the reality of being. To explore what Christian Science nursing brings to healing, let's start with what's required for healing in Christian Science. In Science and Health on page 25, line 13, under the marginal heading entitled Effective Triumph, Mary Baker Eddy identifies what enables us to effectively triumph over sin, disease, and death. She writes, quote, Jesus taught the way of life by demonstration, that we may understand how this divine principle heals the sick, casts out error, and triumphs over death, end quote. So it is God, the divine principle, that does the healing work. Then she continues, quote, Jesus presented the ideal of God better than could any man whose origin was less spiritual. By his obedience to God, he demonstrated more spiritually than all others the principle of being. Hence the force of his admonition, if ye love me, keep my commandments. End quote. So to reveal the healing power of God as Jesus did, we must first recognize and fully trust God as the healer, and then be obedient to God's law. Jesus gave us his two great commandments in order to help us in this journey. And of course, these commandments are to love God with all our heart, mind, and soul, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. When we are in full of divine love, as Jesus was, then there's no room for fear, hatred, pride, envy, deceit, sin, disease, or even death. Instead, there is only room for God's truth to shine through our consciousness as the sunlight shines through a clean window. And this results in healing, or as we understand in Christian Science, the revelation of spiritual perfection. So obedience is the key. Obedience in loving God and adhering to God's law of love. Well, we're here talking about nursing today, so what is it about Christian Science nursing that helps us to love and be obedient? There are many ways to grow in our love for God, but I have found that the qualities Mrs. Eddy outlines for a Christian Science nurse and the inspired expression of them reveal the healing power of divine principle in some pretty amazing ways. And since we're all nurses, we all get to work on having more of these qualities every day. On page 395 of Science and Health, we read, quote, "The nurse should be cheerful, orderly, punctual, patient, full of faith, and receptive to truth and love." So let's explore these qualities today as we think about how to grow in love for and obedience to God. Mr. Webster states that to be cheerful is to be full of spirit. So spiritually speaking, it means to be full of divine spirit, the law of love, which is the substance of man's being. When we are full of spirit, we are full of joy and gratitude for the divine truth of God's allness and man's oneness with him as his spiritual idea. We are expressing God's infinite joy and love for his creation. And this truth leaves no room for any claim that man can be separated from God, his perfect origin. There's no room for fear, and therefore there's no room for sickness, since sickness is solely the manifestation of fear. So when a nurse is cheerful, they are loving God by rejoicing in his allness and goodness, and seeing man's perfect oneness with his father-mother. This is obedience to God's law, and it reveals the healing activity of divine principle. For me, it was this atmosphere of spiritual joy that the Christian Science nurse helped to establish, which facilitated my realization at that time that there could be no accident in God's kingdom of love, and that the only thing that had ever touched me was God's goodness. This understanding helped me to see the horse as a spiritual idea of God, and to acknowledge that we were both governed by divine love. And it was after this affirmation that I was able to forgive the horse, which was a key point in the healing. So in being cheerful, a Christian Science nurse is acknowledging and revealing the fullness of divine spirit. Next, Mrs. Eddy states that a nurse is orderly, which means to be governed by law. Spiritually, this means being governed by the divine order. In Retrospection and Introspection, on page 87, Mrs. Eddy writes about the importance of orderliness in our practice of Christian Science. She says, quote, "Genuine Christian scientists are, or should be, the most systematic and law-abiding people on earth, because their religion demands implicit adherence to fixed rules in the orderly demonstration thereof." Everything in Christian Science stems from an orderly adherence to divine law. This means that our prayers and treatments aren't haphazard. They're logical, inspired, ordered, and follow the rules our pastor outlines for prayer and treatment. The thoughts of a Christian Scientist aren't random. We aren't arbitrarily deciding what to wear, what to eat, what our schedule is. Everything is to be an unfoldment of spiritual inspiration and prayer. Our homes, our activities, our interaction with people, our careers, everything in our experience should stem from spiritually law-abiding thought and prayer. In Christian Science nursing, this means orderliness of thought is manifested in inspired activity and organization of the environment, inspired food preparation, inspired means of caring for the individual. In my situation at camp that summer, this was so important to my healing. The Christian Science nurse was very orderly. She was obedient to divine love's law, and this was expressed as an expectation for right, normal activity, as orderliness in the nursing facility, as orderliness in maintaining a normal schedule, a normal time to wake up, a normal time to eat and bathe and get dressed. I remember one of the first things that the Christian Science nurse did once they got me to the nursing facility was to take me into the bathroom. And she said, "That dirt just doesn't suit you," and proceeded to shower me, to clean me up, to wash my hair, and she even blow-dried it. And I remember how cared for I felt during that time of having been pretty dirty with all sorts of stuff. But she knew it was right. It was right to be clean, and so I was going to be clean. This adherence to order enabled my thought to stay orderly, to pray, to give treatments, to focus on truth. I wasn't distracted by fear, by worry or pity or concerns, all the what-ifs that mortal mind would present in a situation like that. This orderliness enabled me to maintain my expectation of regular harmonious activity for myself. So in being orderly, a Christian Science nurse is revealing the divine order of the kingdom of heaven on earth, and that facilitates healing. A Christian Science nurse is punctual, which means to be prompt or immediate in thought. In Science and Health, Mrs. Eddy quotes Webster's definition of idea on page 115, line 17, which states, "An image in mind, God, the immediate object of understanding." So, to be punctual means to love God's allness and God's idea, the perfect man, immediately and ceaselessly. It means to express God's instantaneous and eternal knowing of the Christ, his perfect idea, which is the same yesterday and today and forever. Medical thought would have said that my condition may have needed accommodation for a certain period of time, that there may have been complications or weaknesses that would follow and certain need for rehabilitation. But in God's law, there is no accommodation for time or cycle or process, for disruption, for chance or any impediments or halting of perfection. There is only divine love meeting every human need and revealing the eternal Christ idea. So to be spiritually prompt means that we unsee the lies right away and love what is eternally true about the situation. St. Paul tells us in the Bible that now is the day of salvation. There is no time, or as Mrs. Eddy explains, no mortal measurements in the law of love, no limitations to God's activity. In my circumstances at that time, I was not tempted to think that time was needed for bone setting, for rib healing, for regaining facial movements, being able to digest food, walking, or even thinking clearly. The Christian Science nurse's promptness helped to affirm this truth. By the first evening, I was walking and eating normal food. The next day, I drove myself out to watch the campers ride their horses. And in a week, when the next session started, I was back on horse and attending to the normal duties and responsibilities that I had. The Christian Science nurse's spiritual punctuality facilitated my love for God and my obedience to him in recognizing him as the only source, cause, or force of activity. Mrs. Eddy says that a Christian Science nurse is patient. Webster defines patience as steadfast despite opposition, difficulty, or adversity. Well, isn't that what God is giving us every day? Steadfastness. A nurse expresses this by being unmoved by the material testimony. He or she is steadfast in expressing God's care and love regardless of mortal mind struggles. Mrs. Eddy writes on page 367 of Science and Health that to bring genuine healing, we must have pitiful patience with the invalid's fears and remove them. We can only help to remove them if we don't entertain them ourselves. God never entertains the material conditions, and his expression, each one of us, does not need to either. It's always helpful for me to remember that mortal mind, not God's spiritual man, is the patient. And so when I am nursing a situation, as we all get to each day, I am sure, I work to remember that I need to be patient with mortal mind's needs as it moves from that first degree of depravity, that state of fear, to the third degree of spiritual understanding, while continually acknowledging the truth of God's man. I remember the loving patience the nurse had with me when mortal mind would tempt me to look at the physical condition. Even after I was fully functioning again, there were hoof marks on my stomach. And it seemed to be quite frustrating because I thought, well, gosh, after all of this healing, and I still have these marks. It was tempting to be quite self-conscious of this, but I was reminded by the Christian Science nurse and the practitioner that I was working with that we weren't in the business of fixing matter in the first place. And so no matter what the material illusion was, whether it was the broken leg or the hoof marks on my stomach, one was not more real than the next. A broken leg is the same error as the hoof print. It's the belief that life is in matter. So as my thought continued to grow in love for God and obedience to his law of eternal perfection, the marks disappeared. Finally, Mrs. Eddy says that a Christian Science nurse is full of faith, full of loyalty to God, receptive to truth and love. Faith, or understanding of the omnipotence, omnipresence, and omniscience of God, so naturally grows out of our love for him and strengthens our obedience to the first commandment. And as this grows, our relationship with God deepens, and our ability to demonstrate the divine principle of being becomes more triumphant. In experiencing the cheerfulness, orderliness, punctuality, patience, and faith of the nurse, coupled with a dedicated treatment of the Christian Science practitioner, I was very quickly and completely healed. In fact, during my very thorough medical examination for the military, they found no trace of the accident, even though they knew, as had been stated in my medical records, all that had taken place. So they let me into the Army, and I continued to go on and jump out of airplanes and run for miles without ever having any complications or any reoccurrence or any challenges from that experience. Over the years, as I've continued to reflect on that healing and have had the opportunity to practice Christian Science in a number of different situations, I've come to see how these nursing qualities have helped me to deepen my love for God and my obedience to his law of love and my expression of his steadfast nursing care. In working to be more full of spirit, more law-abiding, more spiritually punctual, more patient, and more faithful, we can all experience more effective triumphs. And this is what Jesus proved we each can do every day. Heal more effectively through our love and obedience to God. I know that you all, as I do, have opportunities every day to nurse, to care for our fellow man. I've found that from feeding, bathing, and caring for children, to taking meals to a friend, to caring for a home, a business, a church, we can express divine love meeting the human need through healing. But if we approach these opportunities as a person, bringing personal care to another person, we miss the opportunity to bring effective triumph over mortality. Our expression of the 5 nursing qualities that Mrs. Eddy provides enables us to follow Jesus' commands more each day. and this results in effective healing for ourselves and for the world. There is no greater joy that we can all have than participating in spiritual healing. So as Paul says, now thanks be unto God, which always causeth us to triumph in Christ, and maketh manifest the savor of his knowledge by us in every place. Thank you.